The morning sun cast long shadows across the remote military training facility in Nevada, where some of the world's most elite marksmen had gathered for what would become known as the most shocking shooting competition in military history. Among the assembled crowd of seasoned snipers, special forces operators, and military brass, one figure stood out not for her imposing presence, but for her complete ordinariness. Sarah Mitchell adjusted her worn baseball cap and shifted nervously from foot to foot as she watched the other competitors check their equipment. At 34 years old, she was a wildlife photographer from rural Montana who had stumbled into this competition through a series of events that even she couldn't quite believe. Her calloused hands, more accustomed to adjusting camera lenses than rifle scopes, trembled slightly as she gripped her grandfather's old hunting rifle. The weapon itself was almost laughable compared to the high-tech equipment surrounding her. While the military snipers unpacked custom-built rifles worth tens of thousands of dollars, complete with advanced optics, bipods, and precision-engineered components, Sarah's rifle looked like it belonged in a museum. The stock was made of genuine walnut wood, carved by her grandfather's own hands in 1952. The metal showed honest wear from decades of hunting trips in the Montana wilderness, and the scope, while functional, was a simple variable power model that cost less than some of the other competitors' rifle cases. The story of how Sarah had arrived at this moment began 3 months earlier in a small diner in Whitefish, Montana. She had been editing photos on her laptop, images of elk and mountain goats captured during her latest assignment for a nature magazine, when a conversation at the next table caught her attention. Two men in military fatigues were discussing an upcoming precision shooting competition that would pit civilian marksmen against active military snipers. "They're looking for the best civilian shooters in the country," one of the men had said, stirring sugar into his coffee. "The winner gets a $50,000 prize and bragging rights against some of the best snipers in the world." Sarah had initially dismissed the conversation, focusing on her work. But, as the men continued talking about the technical aspects of long-range shooting, she found herself drawn into their discussion. Growing up on a ranch in Montana, she had learned to shoot out of necessity. Predators threatened livestock, and putting food on the table during lean times meant being able to make accurate shots at considerable distances. Her grandfather, William Mitchell, had been her teacher. A veteran of the Korean War and a man who believed in self-reliance above all else, he had spent countless hours with young Sarah, teaching her not just how to shoot, but how to read wind, understand ballistics, and, most importantly, how to remain calm under pressure. His old rifle, the same one she now carried, had been her constant companion during those lessons. "Shooting isn't about the fancy equipment," he used to tell her as they sat in a makeshift blind, watching for deer in the early morning light. "It's about understanding yourself, understanding your environment, and respecting the responsibility that comes with every trigger pull." Those words echoed in Sarah's mind as she listened to the military men discuss the competition. When they mentioned that applications were still being accepted, something stirred within her. It wasn't pride or a desire for the prize money, though both would have been nice. Instead, it was a deep-seated need to honor her grandfather's memory and, perhaps, prove that the old ways of shooting, built on patience, practice, and fundamental understanding, could still compete in a world increasingly dominated by technology. The application process had been surprisingly straightforward. Applicants needed to demonstrate their shooting ability through verified scores at certified ranges, provide references attesting to their character and safety record, and pass a comprehensive background check. Sarah's portfolio of hunting achievements, her work as a wildlife photographer that often required her to work alone in dangerous terrain, and her spotless record with local law enforcement had apparently been enough to earn her a spot among the 32 civilian competitors selected from over 2,000 applicants. Now, standing at the competition site, Sarah couldn't help but feel overwhelmed by the scale of the event. The facility sprawled across several thousand acres of desert terrain, with shooting positions established at various distances stretching out to an almost incomprehensible 4,000 meters. Military personnel moved efficiently around the area, setting up equipment, marking targets, and ensuring that every safety protocol was strictly enforced. The other civilian competitors were impressive in their own right. There was Marcus Rodriguez, a former police SWAT sniper from Los Angeles who had transitioned to competitive shooting after retirement. His equipment bag alone probably cost more than Sarah's truck, and his reputation on the competition circuit was legendary. Then, there was Jennifer Chen, a mechanical engineer from Silicon Valley who had turned precision shooting into a science, approaching every shot with mathematical precision and custom-loaded ammunition that she had developed herself. But it was the military contingent that truly commanded attention. Navy SEALs, Army Rangers, Marine Scout snipers, and Air Force Special Operations personnel represented the absolute pinnacle of military marksmanship. These men and women had honed their skills in combat zones around the world, where a missed shot could mean the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure. Among the military competitors, Staff Sergeant James Morrison of the Navy SEALs drew the most attention. At 28, he had already completed 4 combat deployments and held the unofficial record for the longest confirmed kill shot by a SEAL sniper. His custom rifle, a precision-built platform that incorporated the latest advances in ballistic technology, represented the cutting edge of military marksmanship equipment. Morrison's team had gathered around their shooting position, methodically laying out equipment and running through pre-shot routines that had been perfected through years of training and combat experience. Their spotting scopes, rangefinders, ballistic computers, and weather monitoring equipment created a technological ecosystem designed to eliminate as many variables as possible from the shooting equation. Sarah watched this preparation with a mixture of admiration and intimidation. Her own pre-shot routine was far simpler. She would check her rifle's zero, estimate wind conditions using methods her grandfather had taught her, and trust in the fundamentals that had served her well for over 2 decades of hunting in Montana's challenging terrain. The competition format had been explained during the morning briefing. Shooters would engage targets at progressively longer ranges, starting at 800 meters and culminating in attempts at 3,800 meters. Points would be awarded based on accuracy, with bonus points for first-round hits and penalties for misses that exceeded specific parameters. The scoring system favored consistency over lucky shots, which meant that every round would count. As the morning progressed, Sarah found herself gravitating toward a quiet corner of the staging area where she could observe the other competitors without drawing attention to herself. She noticed how the military teams moved with practiced efficiency, each member knowing their role and executing it flawlessly. The civilian competitors, while skilled, operated more as individuals, lacking the seamless coordination that came from years of training together. The weather conditions for the competition were challenging but not impossible. A steady wind from the west created crosswind conditions that would test every shooter's ability to read environmental factors and adjust accordingly. The temperature was rising as the desert sun climbed higher, creating mirage effects that would make target acquisition increasingly difficult throughout the day. Sarah spent time studying the terrain between the shooting positions and the distant targets. Years of photographing wildlife had taught her to read landscape features that might affect wind patterns. She noticed how the rolling hills and scattered vegetation would create wind shadows and updrafts, invisible factors that could dramatically affect bullet trajectory over the extreme distances they would be shooting. Her grandfather had always emphasized the importance of understanding the environment. "The bullet doesn't care about your intentions," he would say. "It only responds to the laws of physics. Your job is to understand those laws well enough to predict where that bullet will go before you pull the trigger." As the competition organizers made final preparations, Sarah took time to thoroughly inspect her rifle. The action was smooth, worn to perfection through decades of use, but still precise in its function. The trigger, adjusted by a skilled gunsmith years ago, broke cleanly at exactly 3.5 pounds. The barrel, while showing signs of honest wear, still shot to point of aim with remarkable consistency. The scope mounted on the rifle was perhaps its most modern component, though by current standards it was still considered basic. Her grandfather had upgraded to the variable power scope in the 1980s, recognizing that longer shots required better magnification. The glass was clear, the tracking was reliable, and, most importantly, Sarah knew its limitations and capabilities intimately. Other competitors were making last-minute adjustments to their equipment, consulting ballistic charts, and programming data into electronic devices. Sarah's approach was decidedly more analog. She pulled out a small notebook, its pages worn soft from years of use, containing handwritten data about her rifle's performance under various conditions. Wind drift calculations, drop charts, and correction factors filled the pages in her grandfather's careful handwriting, supplemented by her own observations gathered over years of hunting. The psychological pressure was beginning to affect some of the competitors. Sarah could see it in the way conversations became more animated, in the increased frequency of equipment checks, and in the nervous energy that seemed to permeate the staging area. For her part, she found a quiet spot and closed her eyes, centering herself using techniques learned during countless hours waiting for the perfect wildlife photograph. Patience had always been her greatest asset, whether waiting for a bull elk to step into the perfect light for a photograph or holding position for hours to capture the behavior of elusive mountain wildlife. That same patience, she hoped, would serve her well in the coming competition. The announcement came that the competition would begin in 30 minutes. Competitors were instructed to move to their assigned firing positions for the 800-meter stage. Sarah shouldered her rifle and walked toward position 17, trying to project a confidence she didn't entirely feel. As she settled into the shooting position and began her final preparations, Sarah thought about her grandfather and the countless hours they had spent together in the Montana wilderness. He had taught her that shooting was as much about mental discipline as physical skill, that respect for the weapon and the target was paramount, and that true marksmanship came from understanding rather than technology. The targets at 800 meters looked impossibly small through her scope, though she knew that this was just the beginning. If she performed well enough to advance, she would eventually be shooting at distances that pushed the very limits of what was considered possible with conventional rifle and ammunition combinations. Around her, other competitors were settling into their positions, making final adjustments to their equipment and consulting with spotters who would help them read wind conditions and call shot corrections. Sarah worked alone, as she always had, relying on her own eyes, her own judgment, and the skills passed down from a grandfather who believed that self-reliance was the foundation of true marksmanship. The range officer's voice crackled over the loudspeaker system, calling the first relay of shooters to the line. Sarah wasn't in the first group, which gave her additional time to observe wind conditions and watch how other competitors approached the challenge. The first shots of the competition rang out across the desert, the sharp cracks of high-powered rifles echoing off the distant hills. Through her spotting scope, Sarah watched as target markers appeared, indicating hits and misses. The military teams were performing as expected, placing shots with mechanical precision. Several civilian competitors were also shooting well, their years of competition experience evident in their consistent performance. When her relay was called, Sarah moved to the firing line with steady steps. She had made peace with her decision to enter this competition, and now it was simply a matter of executing the fundamentals that had been drilled into her since childhood. The rifle settled naturally into her shoulder, the familiar weight and balance providing comfort in an otherwise intimidating situation. Through the scope, the 800-meter target appeared small but achievable. She began her breathing routine, settling into the natural respiratory pause that provided the steadiest platform for the shot. Wind flags along the range indicated a left-to-right crosswind of approximately 8 miles per hour, consistent with her own observations. Sarah made a mental calculation based on her rifle's known performance and held slightly into the wind, trusting in the data she had collected over years of shooting in similar conditions. The trigger press was smooth and straight back, surprising her as it always should. The rifle recoiled familiar against her shoulder, and she watched through the scope as the target marker appeared almost immediately. Hit. Center ring. A small smile played at the corners of Sarah's mouth as she worked the bolt action, chambering a fresh round. The first shot had been successful, but this was just the beginning of what would prove to be an extraordinary test of skill, determination, and the enduring value of fundamental marksmanship principles. Rising through the ranks. The 1,200-meter stage presented an entirely different level of challenge. As Sarah moved to her new firing position, she could feel the eyes of other competitors and military observers following her progress. Her perfect score at 800 meters had been noted, but many attributed it to beginner's luck rather than genuine skill. The whispered conversations around her suggested that the real test would come at longer distances where equipment advantages would become more pronounced. The wind had shifted since the morning, now coming from the southwest at variable speeds that created challenging conditions for reading environmental factors. Sarah settled behind her rifle and began the process of range estimation and wind evaluation that her grandfather had taught her decades ago. She held up a blade of grass, feeling the wind's direction and approximate speed, then compared her observations to the behavior of the range flags scattered across the desert floor. Staff Sergeant Morrison was positioned 3 spots to her left, and she could hear his team's sophisticated wind-reading equipment providing constant updates on atmospheric conditions. Their electronic weather station displayed wind speed, direction, temperature, humidity, and barometric pressure in real time, feeding data to a ballistic computer that would calculate precise firing solutions for each shot. In contrast, Sarah's methods appeared almost primitive. She made notes in her grandfather's old notebook using a pencil worn down to a stub, calculating corrections based on formulas and techniques that predated the electronic age. Yet as she worked through her mental checklist, she felt the confidence that came from years of successful hunting in Montana's unpredictable mountain weather. The 1,200-meter targets were barely visible to the naked eye, appearing as small dark squares against the tan-colored backdrop of the desert hills. Through her scope, set at its maximum magnification of 12 power, the targets were clear enough to aim at, though distinguishing the scoring rings required careful observation and steady hold. Marcus Rodriguez, the former police sniper, was in the firing position next to Sarah. His equipment was impressive by any standard, featuring a custom rifle built specifically for long-range competition shooting. The stock was adjustable in multiple dimensions, the barrel was heavy contour for maximum accuracy, and the scope offered magnification up to 25 power with target quality glass that cost more than most people's cars. "Nice shooting at 800, Rodriguez commented as he settled into position. "That wind's going to be trickier up here though. You might want to hold a little more left than you think." Sarah appreciated the advice, though she had already calculated her own wind correction based on observations of the grass movement and dust patterns visible through her scope. The veteran's comment did remind her that she was still very much the outsider in this gathering of experienced competitive shooters and military professionals. As the first relay began shooting at 1,200 meters, Sarah watched the target indicators carefully. The increased distance had eliminated several competitors who had performed well at the shorter range. Wind reading became critical at this distance, where a small miscalculation could result in a complete miss of the target frame. The military teams continued to perform with mechanical precision, their systematic approach to environmental reading and ballistic calculation producing consistent hits. However, even among the elite military snipers, some were beginning to struggle with the challenging conditions. The desert environment was proving to be more difficult than the controlled conditions many of them were accustomed to in training. Jennifer Chen, the engineer from Silicon Valley, was having particular difficulty with the wind conditions. Despite her mathematical approach and precisely loaded ammunition, her shots were consistently being pushed off target by environmental factors she couldn't quite read correctly. Her frustration was evident as she consulted multiple electronic devices between shots, trying to find a technological solution to what was fundamentally a problem of fieldcraft. When Sarah's relay was called to the line, she moved with the same deliberate calm that had characterized her approach throughout the morning. The rifle felt comfortable in her hands, and she had complete confidence in her wind reading assessment. Based on her observations, she calculated a correction of approximately 14 inches to the left, accounting for the crosswind component and the bullet's flight time over the extended distance. The first shot at 1,200 meters required more patience than the 800-meter stage. Sarah settled into her shooting position and began the breathing routine that would provide the steadiest possible platform. The crosshairs settled on the target's center, adjusted for her calculated wind correction, and she began the smooth trigger press that would send the bullet on its way. The rifle's recoil was familiar and comforting, and, through her scope, Sarah watched for the target indicator that would appear within seconds of impact. When the marker showed, her heart rate increased slightly with satisfaction. Another center ring hit. The second shot at 1,200 meters confirmed that her first wasn't accidental. Sarah's wind reading had been accurate, and her rifle was performing exactly as expected based on years of careful observation and record keeping. As she prepared for her third and final shot at this distance, she noticed that several other competitors were struggling with consistency. Morrison's team was performing well, their technological approach providing reliable results even in the challenging conditions. However, Sarah observed that their shooting process was slower than her own, requiring consultation with multiple team members and electronic systems before each shot. While their hit probability was high, their time to target engagement was significantly longer than what she was achieving with her more streamlined approach. The third shot at 1,200 meters was Sarah's best of the stage. Everything came together perfectly: wind reading, rifle hold, trigger control, and follow-through. The bullet struck exactly where she had intended, producing another center ring hit and a perfect score for the 1,200-meter stage. As competitors moved to the 1,800-meter line, the atmosphere began to change noticeably. This distance represented the point where many civilian competitors would be eliminated, and even experienced military snipers would be tested to their limits. The targets were barely visible even through high magnification optics, and environmental factors became critically important. The wind conditions at 1,800 meters presented multiple challenges. What appeared to be a consistent crosswind at the firing line was actually variable across the bullet's flight path. Sarah could see dust devils in the distance, indicating areas where wind direction might be completely different from what was being measured at her position. This was exactly the type of complex environmental reading that her grandfather had prepared her for during their hunting expeditions. At long distances, you're not just shooting at a target, he had explained during one memorable lesson when she was 16. You're shooting through a column of air that might have different conditions every 100 yards along the way. The best equipment in the world won't help you if you don't understand what that air is doing to your bullet. Those words proved prophetic as Sarah watched several competitors struggle with the 1,800-meter stage. Shooters who had performed well at shorter distances were having difficulty reading the complex wind patterns that affected bullet trajectory over the extended flight path. Electronic wind meters could only measure conditions at the firing point, leaving the rest of the bullet's journey to educated guesswork based on visual observation of environmental indicators. Rodriguez was the first in Sarah's relay to engage the 1,800-meter target. Despite his impressive equipment and years of competition experience, his first shot struck low and right of the target center. He made an adjustment based on spotter feedback and fired again, achieving a hit closer to the center but still not in the high-scoring rings. The military shooters were experiencing similar challenges. Morrison's team was spending considerable time analyzing data and discussing wind conditions before each shot. Their methodical approach was producing hits, but the scores were lower than their performance at shorter distances had suggested. When Sarah's turn came, she felt more confident than she had expected. The 1,800-meter distance was certainly challenging, but it was not beyond the range at which she had successfully taken game in the Montana mountains. Her grandfather's rifle had proven itself capable of accurate shooting at such distances, and her own skill level had been validated by the morning's performance. The wind reading at 1,800 meters required careful observation of multiple indicators. Sarah noted the behavior of grass and brush at various distances between her position and the target, looking for patterns that would indicate wind direction and velocity changes along the bullet's path. She observed a slight wind shadow created by a low ridge about halfway to the target, which would reduce the crosswind effect for a portion of the bullet's flight. Her calculation process remained the same methodology she had used for shorter distances, but the corrections were more dramatic. She estimated a wind correction of approximately 36 inches to the left, a hold that would place her point of aim well off the visible target but would compensate for the bullet's drift during its time of flight. The first shot at 1,800 meters required complete trust in her calculations and environmental reading. There was no opportunity for trial shots or corrections based on observed impact. Each shot had to be precisely planned and executed based on the shooter's understanding of ballistics and environmental conditions. Sarah's breathing routine became even more important at this distance. Any movement or tremor would be magnified over the bullet's extended flight path, potentially causing a miss despite perfect environmental reading and ballistic calculation. She settled into the natural respiratory pause and began her trigger press, maintaining perfect sight alignment as the rifle fired. The wait for target indication seemed longer at 1,800 meters, though it was actually only a few seconds. When the marker appeared, Sarah allowed herself a small smile of satisfaction. Center ring again. Her consistency was beginning to draw serious attention from competition organizers and other shooters. What had been dismissed as beginner's luck at 800 meters was clearly something more significant. Sarah Mitchell, the unknown wildlife photographer from Montana, was shooting with accuracy that rivaled the best military snipers in the competition. The second shot at 1,800 meters confirmed her growing reputation. Despite changing wind conditions, Sarah adapted her hold and delivered another precise shot. The rifle's performance remained consistent, and her confidence in her environmental reading abilities continued to grow. Morrison approached her position during a break between relays. "I've been watching your shooting," he said with genuine curiosity. "Your wind reading is exceptional. How are you getting such consistent reads without electronic equipment?" Sarah appreciated the question and the respect it implied. "My grandfather taught me to read sign," she replied simply. "Wind leaves traces in the environment if you know how to look for them." The Navy SEAL nodded thoughtfully. He had years of training and access to the most advanced equipment available, but he was beginning to understand that Sarah's approach represented a different type of expertise, one based on fundamental fieldcraft rather than technological solutions. As the 1,800-meter stage concluded, the field of competitors had been significantly reduced. Many civilian shooters had been eliminated by the challenging conditions, and even some military personnel had posted scores that would make advancing to longer distances difficult. Sarah's perfect performance continued to surprise everyone except herself. She had never doubted her ability to shoot accurately at these distances. The only question had been whether she could do so consistently under the pressure of formal competition. The answer was becoming increasingly clear. The 2,400-meter stage would represent the ultimate test for most competitors. At this distance, bullet drop exceeded 6 feet, wind drift could move the projectile several feet laterally, and even tiny variations in rifle hold or trigger control would be magnified to dramatic proportions. This was the range where equipment advantages might finally overcome fundamental shooting skills, where the most advanced technology would prove its worth against traditional methods. As Sarah prepared for what many considered the most challenging stage of the competition, she reflected on the journey that had brought her to this point. The morning had validated her grandfather's teaching and proven that patient observation and fundamental marksmanship could compete with the most modern approaches to long-range shooting. However, she also understood that the greatest challenges still lay ahead. The distances she would face next would test every aspect of her shooting ability and push both her and her grandfather's old rifle to their absolute limits. #The Proving Ground. The afternoon sun had shifted position significantly by the time competitors moved to the 2,400-meter line, creating new challenges in the form of heat mirage that danced across the desert floor like invisible fire. Sarah squinted through her scope, watching the shimmering air distort the distant target into a wavering phantom that seemed to dance just beyond the reach of precise aim. Only 12 competitors remained in the contest, a dramatic reduction from the 32 who had begun the morning with such confidence. The attrition had been steady and merciless, claiming victims among both civilian shooters and military personnel who had underestimated the complexity of reading environmental conditions across such extreme distances. Among those eliminated was Jennifer Chen, the engineer whose mathematical approach had proven insufficient for the intuitive aspects of wind reading that dominated long-range shooting. Marcus Rodriguez had also fallen victim to the challenging conditions, his impressive equipment unable to compensate for subtle miscalculations in environmental assessment that accumulated into misses at extended range. The remaining field represented the absolute elite of competitive and military marksmanship. Staff Sergeant Morrison and his Navy SEAL team had advanced, as expected, along with 2 other military units whose performance had been consistently excellent throughout the day. The civilian contingent had been reduced to just 3 shooters, with Sarah representing perhaps the most unlikely survivor among the remaining competitors. The 2,400-meter targets were almost invisible to the naked eye, appearing as tiny specks against the brown hills that marked the far end of the shooting range. Even through Sarah's 12-power scope, the targets required careful searching to locate and precise focusing to distinguish the scoring rings from the surrounding terrain features. At this distance, every aspect of shooting technique became critically important. The slightest tremor in rifle hold would translate to inches of error at the target. Trigger control had to be absolutely perfect, with any disturbing pressure causing the rifle to move during the critical moment of bullet departure. Even breathing technique became a factor, as the natural motion of respiration could affect point of aim during the extended time required to establish a proper sight picture. Sarah's preparation routine for 2,400 meters was more thorough than her approach to shorter distances had required. She spent several minutes studying the terrain between her position and the target, looking for visual indicators that would help her understand wind patterns across the entire flight path. The bullet would be in the air for over 3 seconds, traveling through columns of air that might have completely different characteristics at various points along its trajectory. The heat mirage presented a particular challenge that her grandfather had warned her about during summer hunting trips in the open country of eastern Montana. Rising thermal currents created optical distortions that could make targets appear higher or lower than their actual positions, and the shimmering effect could mask subtle wind indicators that were crucial for accurate environmental reading. When the air starts dancing, her grandfather had explained during one sweltering July afternoon, you have to look past what your eyes want to see and trust what you know about the conditions. The mirage will try to fool you, but the grass and dust will still tell you what the wind is really doing. Sarah applied that advice as she observed conditions at 2,400 meters. While the mirage made optical observation more difficult, she could still read wind direction and approximate velocity by watching the movement of vegetation scattered across the range. A small dust devil approximately 1,000 meters downrange indicated an area of variable wind that would affect bullet trajectory during a critical portion of its flight. Morrison's team had set up an impressive array of environmental monitoring equipment for the 2,400-meter stage. Their weather station provided continuous updates on atmospheric conditions, while their spotting scope incorporated a ranging system that could measure precise distances to environmental features along the bullet's path. The technological approach to long-range shooting was functioning exactly as designed, providing detailed data that would be fed into ballistic computers for precise firing solutions. Yet despite their technological advantages, Sarah noticed that the military team was spending considerable time between shots, analyzing data and consulting multiple sources of information before each engagement. Their methodical approach was producing accurate results, but the process appeared more complex and time-intensive than her own streamlined methodology. The first shot at 2,400 meters would be the most challenging Sarah had ever attempted in competition. Her calculations indicated a wind correction of nearly 5 feet to the left, a hold that would place her point of aim completely off the visible target area. The bullet drop at this distance exceeded 6 feet, requiring an elevation adjustment that pushed her scope to near its maximum available travel. Trust in her equipment became paramount at such extreme ranges. Sarah had verified her rifle's trajectory data through careful testing over the years, but 2,400 meters represented the outer limit of distances at which she had practical shooting experience. Her grandfather's old rifle was being asked to perform at the very edge of its effective range, relying on ammunition that, while carefully selected, was standard hunting rounds rather than the precisely tuned match loads that other competitors were using. The shooting position for 2,400 meters required absolute stability. Sarah adjusted her bipod legs carefully, ensuring that the rifle was perfectly level and that her body position provided maximum support for the extended time required to establish a proper sight picture. Her breathing routine became even more critical, as any movement during the aiming process could result in a complete miss at such distances. Through her scope, the target appeared impossibly small and distant. The crosshairs seemed to waver with every heartbeat, requiring perfect timing to achieve the moment of stillness necessary for an accurate shot. Sarah settled into her established routine, trusting in the fundamentals that had served her well throughout the day. The trigger press at 2,400 meters required absolute perfection. Any disturbance to the rifle's position during bullet departure would be magnified dramatically over the extended range. Sarah began her slow, steady pressure straight back on the trigger, maintaining perfect sight alignment as the firing pin fell. The recoil felt different at extreme range, perhaps because of the psychological weight of the shot's importance. Sarah maintained her position behind the scope, watching for the target indicator that would appear several seconds after impact. The wait seemed eternal, though in reality it was only the time required for the bullet to complete its long arc across the desert. When the target marker finally appeared, Sarah felt a surge of relief and satisfaction that surprised her with its intensity. Center ring. Her first shot at 2,400 meters had found its mark precisely where she had intended, validating her environmental reading and confirming her rifle's capability at extreme range. The second shot at 2,400 meters presented different challenges as wind conditions continued to evolve throughout the afternoon. Sarah observed changes in the behavior of distant vegetation that indicated shifting patterns in the complex air currents that would affect bullet trajectory. Her adjustment for the second shot reflected these observations, modifying her wind correction based on updated environmental assessment. Morrison's team fired their second shot just before Sarah's relay was called to the line. Despite their sophisticated equipment and systematic approach, their shot struck outside the center ring, though still within the target scoring area. The complexity of environmental conditions at 2,400 meters was testing even the most advanced technological approaches to long-range shooting. Sarah's second shot produced another center ring hit, confirming that her environmental reading skills were functioning effectively at extreme range. The consistency of her performance was becoming increasingly noteworthy, particularly given the simplicity of her equipment compared to the high-tech systems employed by other remaining competitors. The third shot at 2,400 meters would complete the most challenging stage Sarah had ever faced in competition. Wind conditions had become increasingly complex as the afternoon progressed, with thermal effects and changing atmospheric pressure creating variables that were difficult to predict or measure precisely. Her approach to the final shot remained fundamentally the same as her methodology throughout the day. Careful observation of environmental indicators, calculation of corrections based on her rifle's known performance characteristics, and trust in the fundamental shooting techniques that had been drilled into her through years of practice and hunting experience. The shot felt perfect from the moment Sarah pressed the trigger. Everything came together with the kind of precision that every marksman experiences occasionally but can never completely predict or control. The rifle recoiled naturally, the sight picture remained undisturbed through the shot sequence, and the environmental reading had been precisely accurate. Center ring again. 3 perfect shots at 2,400 meters, a performance that was beginning to draw attention from competition officials and media representatives who had come to document what was expected to be a showcase of military marksmanship superiority. As competitors prepared to move to the 3,200-meter line, Sarah realized that she had advanced farther in the competition than she had ever imagined possible. The distances ahead would test the absolute limits of both her shooting ability and her grandfather's rifle, but her confidence was growing with each successful engagement. The remaining field had been reduced to just 8 competitors. Morrison's SEAL team remained in contention, along with 2 other military units whose performance had been consistently excellent. Among civilians, only Sarah and 2 others had survived the challenging conditions that had eliminated so many skilled shooters. The 3,200-meter stage would represent uncharted territory for Sarah. While she had occasionally shot at similar distances during hunting trips in Montana, she had never attempted such shots under the pressure of formal competition or with the level of precision required for accurate scoring. This would be a true test of whether her fundamental approach to marksmanship could compete with the most advanced military and technological systems at the very extremes of rifle capability. The late afternoon light was creating new challenges as shadows began to lengthen across the desert floor. Target visibility was becoming more difficult, and the changing light conditions were affecting the behavior of heat mirage and thermal currents that influenced wind patterns. Sarah would need to adapt her environmental reading techniques to account for these evolving conditions while maintaining the accuracy that had brought her this far in the competition. The stakes were becoming clear as the final stages approached. What had begun as an interesting challenge for Sarah was evolving into something much more significant. Her performance was proving that traditional marksmanship fundamentals, properly applied, could compete with the most modern approaches to long-range shooting. The implications extended far beyond the competition itself, touching on questions about the role of technology versus fundamental skill in military and competitive shooting. As Sarah prepared for the 3,200-meter challenge, she thought about her grandfather and the countless hours they had spent together learning the subtleties of long-range shooting. His emphasis on understanding rather than equipment was being validated in ways that he probably never could have imagined. The old rifle he had crafted and tuned was performing at levels that rivaled the most sophisticated modern systems, guided by skills and knowledge that had been passed down through patient teaching and careful practice. The 3,200-meter stage would determine whether Sarah's remarkable run could continue, or whether the extreme distances would finally reveal the limitations of her traditional approach to precision shooting. #Beyond the impossible. The 3,200-meter line represented the edge of what most marksmen considered possible with conventional rifle and ammunition combinations. At this distance, gravitational drop exceeded 9 feet, requiring extreme elevation adjustments that pushed optical systems to their mechanical limits. Wind drift could move projectiles several yards laterally, and even minor variations in atmospheric conditions could render careful calculations meaningless. Only 6 competitors remained as the afternoon shadows grew longer across the Nevada desert. The elimination rate had accelerated dramatically at longer distances, claiming victims among both military and civilian shooters who had performed excellently at shorter ranges. The surviving group represented the absolute pinnacle of marksmanship capability, individuals whose skills and equipment had proven adequate for challenges that exceeded normal training parameters. Sarah's continued presence in this elite group was drawing serious attention from competition observers. Military personnel who had initially dismissed her as an interesting but ultimately doomed amateur were now studying her technique with professional curiosity. Her consistent performance with equipment that appeared primitive by modern standards was challenging fundamental assumptions about the relationship between technology and accuracy in precision shooting. Staff Sergeant Morrison's Navy SEAL team remained in contention, their systematic approach and advanced equipment functioning exactly as designed even under extreme conditions. However, Sarah noticed that their shooting pace had slowed considerably as distances increased, requiring extensive consultation between team members and careful analysis of multiple data sources before each shot. The remaining military competitors included Master Sergeant David Chen of the Army's 1st Special Forces Group, whose performance had been remarkably consistent throughout the competition. Chen's approach differed somewhat from Morrison's technology-heavy methodology, incorporating more intuitive elements that reminded Sarah of her grandfather's emphasis on environmental reading and fundamental shooting skills. Among civilians, Sarah was joined by only one other survivor, Robert Fleming, a retired Marine sniper who had transitioned to competitive shooting after military service. Fleming's equipment and technique represented a hybrid approach between military systematic methodology and civilian competitive shooting innovations. His performance had been steady throughout the day, though not quite matching Sarah's perfect scores. The 3,200-meter targets were barely visible even through high-magnification optics, appearing as tiny dark squares against the distant hillside that marked the extreme range of the shooting facility. Through Sarah's 12-power scope, the targets required careful searching to locate and precise optical alignment to distinguish from surrounding terrain features. At this distance, environmental factors became overwhelmingly important. The bullet would remain in flight for nearly 4 seconds, traveling through atmospheric conditions that might vary significantly across the extended trajectory. Temperature gradients, pressure differentials, and wind patterns could change dramatically between the firing position and target area, creating variables that were impossible to measure with complete precision. Sarah's preparation for 3,200 meters was more thorough than any shooting she had ever attempted. She spent nearly 15 minutes observing environmental conditions, looking for patterns in vegetation movement, dust behavior, and atmospheric disturbances that would indicate wind characteristics along the bullet's flight path. Her notebook filled with calculations and corrections as she worked through the complex ballistic equation that such extreme range required. The heat mirage had evolved throughout the afternoon, creating optical distortions that made target location and environmental reading increasingly challenging. Sarah found herself relying more heavily on indirect indicators of wind conditions, reading sign in areas where thermal effects were minimal while extrapolating patterns across the entire range. Morrison's team had positioned their most sophisticated environmental monitoring equipment for the 3,200-meter stage. Their weather station network included sensors at multiple distances downrange, providing real-time atmospheric data from various points along the bullet's trajectory. The technological approach to extreme-range shooting had reached its full implementation, incorporating every available tool for environmental analysis and ballistic calculation. Yet Sarah observed that the military team's shooting process had become increasingly complex and time-intensive. Each shot required consultation with multiple team members, analysis of data from various electronic systems, and careful calculation of firing solutions that accounted for dozens of measured variables. The systematic approach was comprehensive but appeared to lack the intuitive flow that characterized her own methodology. The first shot at 3,200 meters would require the most extreme corrections Sarah had ever attempted in practical shooting. Her calculations indicated a wind drift correction of nearly 8 feet to the left, a hold that would place her point of aim completely outside the visible target area. The elevation correction needed to compensate for bullet drop exceeded the adjustment range of her scope, requiring her to use Kentucky windage techniques that relied on knowledge of her reticle's subtensions. Trust in her equipment and calculations became absolute at such extreme range. Sarah had no practical experience shooting at 3,200 meters, forcing her to rely entirely on extrapolated data from shorter distances and theoretical ballistic calculations. Her grandfather's rifle was being asked to perform far beyond any application for which it had been originally designed, yet the fundamental accuracy and consistency that had served her throughout the competition remained unchanged. The shooting position for 3,200 meters required every technique for maximizing stability and consistency. Sarah adjusted her equipment with meticulous care, ensuring that her bipod was perfectly level and that her body position provided optimal support for the extended aiming process. The slightest movement or inconsistency in position would be magnified dramatically over the extreme range. Through her scope, the target was almost impossible to distinguish from the surrounding terrain. The crosshairs seemed to wander continuously despite her best efforts to maintain steady hold, requiring perfect timing to achieve the moment of stillness necessary for an accurate shot. Sarah's breathing routine became crucial, as respiratory motion could affect point of aim during the several seconds required to establish proper sight alignment. The trigger press at 3,200 meters demanded absolute perfection. Sarah began her slow, steady pressure straight back, monitoring sight alignment continuously while maintaining the mental picture of her intended point of impact based on calculated corrections for wind and elevation. The shot broke cleanly, surprising her as it should, and she maintained position behind the scope to observe impact. The wait for target indication at 3,200 meters seemed to last forever, though it was actually only the flight time required for the bullet to complete its extreme trajectory. When the marker finally appeared, Sarah felt a combination of relief, satisfaction, and amazement that surprised her with its intensity. Center ring. Her first shot at 3,200 meters had found its mark exactly where she had calculated it should strike. The successful shot at extreme range validated not only Sarah's shooting ability but also her grandfather's rifle and the fundamental principles that had guided her throughout the competition. The wooden-stocked hunting rifle had proven capable of accuracy that rivaled the most sophisticated modern systems, confirming that fundamental design excellence could transcend technological advancement. Morrison's team engaged their target shortly after Sarah's success. Despite their comprehensive approach and advanced equipment, their first shot struck outside the center ring, though still within the scoring area. The complexity of environmental conditions at 3,200 meters was proving challenging even for the most systematic technological approaches to precision shooting. Sarah's second shot at 3,200 meters faced evolved conditions as atmospheric patterns continued to change throughout the afternoon. Her environmental reading indicated subtle shifts in wind direction and velocity that required adjusted corrections from her first shot. The ability to adapt calculations based on observed changes became crucial at extreme range, where static corrections based on initial conditions might become inaccurate as environmental factors evolved. The second shot produced another center ring hit, confirming that Sarah's environmental reading skills remained accurate even at the limits of practical shooting range. Her consistency at extreme distance was becoming remarkable, particularly given the increasing difficulty that other competitors were experiencing as ranges extended beyond normal training parameters. Fleming, the retired Marine, was struggling with the 3,200-meter challenge despite his extensive military training and competitive experience. His shots were finding the target but not achieving the precision necessary for high scores. The extreme range was revealing subtle limitations in environmental reading ability that hadn't been apparent at shorter distances. Sarah's third shot at 3,200 meters would complete her performance at what many considered the practical limit of accuracy for conventional rifle systems. Wind conditions had continued to evolve, requiring fresh calculations based on updated environmental observations. Her approach remained fundamentally unchanged: careful observation, methodical calculation, and trust in techniques that had proven reliable throughout the competition. The final shot felt as perfect as any she had fired during the competition. Every element of her shooting process came together with precision that represented the culmination of decades of practice and environmental observation. The rifle recoiled naturally, the sight picture remained undisturbed, and her environmental reading had been accurately applied to the extreme conditions. Center ring again. 3 perfect shots at 3,200 meters, a performance that was drawing attention from military observers and competition officials who had never witnessed such consistency at extreme range from any competitor, regardless of equipment or background. As preparations began for the final stage at 3,800 meters, Sarah realized that she had achieved something unprecedented in the competition's history. Her perfect performance through all previous stages had positioned her as the leading scorer entering the ultimate challenge, ahead of military snipers whose training and equipment represented the highest levels of professional marksmanship capability. The field for 3,800 meters had been reduced to just 4 competitors. Morrison's SEAL team remained in contention, their technological approach having proven adequate for advancement despite the increasing challenges of extreme-range shooting. Master Sergeant Chen had also survived the 3,200-meter elimination, his hybrid methodology continuing to produce acceptable results under extreme conditions. Fleming had been eliminated at 3,200 meters, his military training and competitive experience proving insufficient for the demands of such extreme-range shooting. Sarah was now the only civilian remaining in a competition that had been expected to demonstrate military superiority in precision marksmanship. The 3,800-meter stage would represent the absolute limit of the competition and the outer edge of what was considered possible with conventional rifle technology. At this distance, every factor that affected bullet trajectory would be magnified to extreme proportions. Environmental reading would become as much art as science, requiring intuitive understanding that transcended pure technical calculation. The stakes had evolved beyond simple competition as Sarah prepared for the final challenge. Her performance was demonstrating that fundamental marksmanship skills, properly developed and applied, could compete with and potentially exceed the capabilities of the most advanced technological approaches to precision shooting. The implications extended far beyond the immediate competition, touching on questions about training philosophy, equipment priorities, and the enduring value of traditional shooting disciplines. The wooden rifle that had been her grandfather's pride was about to face its ultimate test, guided by knowledge and skills that represented generations of accumulated wisdom about the art and science of precision marksmanship. The final stage would determine whether Sarah's remarkable journey would culminate in an upset victory that would rewrite assumptions about what was possible in the world of extreme-range shooting. #The shot heard around the world. The 3,800-meter line existed at the very frontier of what physics and human capability could achieve together. At this distance, gravitational drop exceeded 12 feet, requiring elevation adjustments that pushed rifle scopes beyond their mechanical design limits. The bullet would remain airborne for over 4.5 seconds, traveling through nearly 2.5 miles of atmosphere that could contain countless variables capable of affecting trajectory in unpredictable ways. 4 competitors remained as the Nevada sun began its descent toward the western horizon, casting long shadows across the desert that would complicate target acquisition and environmental reading. The elimination process had been merciless, claiming victims among seasoned professionals whose credentials represented the pinnacle of military and competitive marksmanship. Those who remained faced a challenge that would test the absolute limits of their skills, equipment, and psychological resilience. Sarah stood at her equipment table, methodically checking her grandfather's rifle one final time. The wooden stock showed honest wear from decades of hunting trips, and the metal surfaces bore the patina of age and use, yet the rifle's fundamental accuracy remained unchanged. Every shot fired during the competition had confirmed the weapon's capability and consistency, validating her grandfather's belief that precision came from understanding and craftsmanship rather than technological complexity. Staff Sergeant Morrison's Navy SEAL team occupied the firing position adjacent to Sarah's. Their array of environmental monitoring equipment had expanded for the final stage, incorporating atmospheric sensors, ballistic computers, and optical systems that represented the cutting edge of military precision shooting technology. The systematic approach that had carried them through earlier stages would face its ultimate test at a distance that challenged the very limits of conventional rifle capability. Master Sergeant Chen of Army Special Forces had positioned himself at the far end of the firing line, his equipment and methodology representing a middle ground between high-technology systems and fundamental fieldcraft. His performance throughout the competition had been steady and professional, though not quite matching the perfection that Sarah had demonstrated at every distance. The fourth remaining competitor was Captain Sarah Williams of the Marine Corps, a scout sniper whose advancement to the final stage had surprised many observers. Her shooting style emphasized speed and efficiency over technological complexity, relying heavily on developed instincts and environmental reading skills that complemented rather than replaced systematic training. The 3,800-meter targets were invisible to the naked eye, requiring optical aids even to locate them against the distant hillside. Through Sarah's 12-power scope, the targets appeared as tiny geometric shapes that wavered constantly in the atmospheric disturbance created by thermal effects and varying air density. Target identification required patient searching and precise optical alignment that demanded perfect stability and concentration. At this extreme distance, environmental factors dominated every aspect of the shooting equation. Temperature gradients between the firing position and target area could create atmospheric refraction that bent light rays and affected apparent target position. Pressure differentials might exist along the bullet's flight path, creating density variations that would influence ballistic performance. Wind patterns could change direction multiple times across the extended trajectory, requiring environmental reading skills that bordered on intuitive understanding. Sarah's preparation for 3,800 meters involved the most thorough environmental analysis she had ever attempted. She spent nearly 30 minutes observing atmospheric conditions, looking for patterns and indicators that would help her understand the complex air mass through which her bullet would travel. Her notebook filled with calculations, corrections, and observations as she worked through ballistic equations that required extrapolation far beyond her practical shooting experience. The late afternoon light created additional challenges as shadows and changing illumination affected both target visibility and environmental reading. Heat mirage continued to distort visual observations, requiring Sarah to rely increasingly on indirect indicators of atmospheric conditions. She found herself applying techniques her grandfather had taught her for reading sign in difficult conditions, looking for subtle clues that revealed wind patterns and thermal effects. Morrison's team had deployed their most sophisticated equipment for the final stage. Their environmental monitoring network included sensors at multiple points downrange, providing real-time atmospheric data from various locations along the bullet's trajectory. Weather stations measured temperature, humidity, pressure, and wind velocity with scientific precision, feeding data to ballistic computers that would calculate firing solutions accounting for dozens of measured variables. The technological approach to extreme-range shooting had reached its full implementation, incorporating every available tool for environmental analysis and trajectory prediction. Yet Sarah observed that the process had become increasingly complex, requiring extensive consultation between team members and analysis of multiple data sources before each shot could be attempted. Her own methodology remained fundamentally unchanged from the techniques her grandfather had taught her decades ago. Environmental reading based on visual observation of natural indicators, ballistic calculations using formulas and techniques that predated electronic computation, and trust in fundamental shooting principles that had proven reliable under all conditions encountered throughout the competition. The first shot at 3,800 meters would require corrections that exceeded anything Sarah had ever attempted. Her calculations indicated a wind drift adjustment of nearly 12 feet to the left, a hold that would place her point of aim completely outside any visible reference point. The elevation correction needed to compensate for extreme bullet drop exceeded the adjustment range of her scope by a significant margin, forcing her to use holdover techniques that relied on her precise knowledge of reticle geometry and subtensions. Trust in her calculations became absolute at such extreme range. Sarah had no practical experience shooting at 3,800 meters, requiring complete reliance on extrapolated ballistic data and theoretical projections based on her rifle's known performance at shorter distances. Every element of uncertainty had to be resolved through confident application of fundamental principles and careful environmental observation. The shooting position for 3,800 meters demanded perfection in every detail. Sarah adjusted her bipod with meticulous precision, ensuring that her rifle was perfectly level and that her body position provided optimal stability for the extended aiming process required at extreme range. The slightest inconsistency in setup would be magnified dramatically across the bullet's lengthy trajectory. Through her scope, the target was barely distinguishable from surrounding terrain features. The crosshairs seemed to move constantly despite her efforts to maintain steady hold, requiring extraordinary patience to achieve the moment of stillness necessary for an accurate shot. Sarah's breathing routine became critical, as any respiratory motion could affect point of aim during the several seconds needed to establish proper sight alignment. The mental pressure at 3,800 meters was unlike anything Sarah had experienced during the competition. This single shot would determine not only her final placement but also validate or disprove the effectiveness of traditional marksmanship methods against modern technological approaches. The implications extended far beyond personal achievement, touching on fundamental questions about training philosophy and equipment priorities in military and competitive shooting. Sarah settled into her established routine, trusting in techniques that had served her reliably throughout the day. Her environmental reading indicated complex wind patterns that would require precise calculation to overcome. The hold she had calculated would place her point of aim farther off the visible target than seemed reasonable, yet her confidence in the fundamental principles remained absolute. The trigger press at 3,800 meters demanded perfection that transcended normal shooting technique. Sarah began her slow, steady pressure straight back, monitoring sight alignment continuously while maintaining mental focus on her calculated point of impact. The shot broke cleanly, and she maintained position behind the scope despite the natural tendency to immediately look for impact indication. The wait for target confirmation at 3,800 meters seemed eternal. The bullet's flight time exceeded 4 seconds, during which atmospheric conditions could potentially change enough to affect trajectory. When the target marker finally appeared, Sarah felt a surge of emotion that surprised her with its intensity. Center ring. Her first shot at 3,800 meters had struck exactly where she had calculated, validating her environmental reading and confirming that her grandfather's rifle could perform accurately at distances that challenged the very limits of conventional marksmanship. Morrison's team engaged their target minutes after Sarah's success. Despite their comprehensive technological approach and systematic methodology, their first shot struck outside the center scoring ring. The extreme complexity of environmental conditions at 3,800 meters was proving challenging even for the most advanced equipment and professional training available. Master Sergeant Chen's attempt resulted in a target hit but not in the high-scoring central area. The Army sniper's steady performance throughout the competition had finally encountered conditions that exceeded his capability for precise environmental reading at extreme range. Captain Williams faced her target with the efficiency that had characterized her approach throughout the day. Her shot struck the target frame but failed to achieve scoring accuracy, confirming that 3,800 meters represented the practical limit of capability for most marksmen regardless of their training or experience. Sarah's second shot at 3,800 meters faced evolved atmospheric conditions as the late afternoon environment continued to change. Her environmental reading indicated subtle shifts in wind patterns that required adjusted corrections from her first shot calculations. The ability to adapt to changing conditions became crucial at extreme range, where static firing solutions might become obsolete within minutes. The second shot produced another center ring hit, an achievement that was beginning to draw attention from competition officials and observers who had never witnessed such accuracy at extreme range. Sarah's consistency with basic equipment was challenging fundamental assumptions about the relationship between technology and marksmanship capability. Morrison's second attempt with full technological support resulted in a hit closer to target center but still not achieving the precision that Sarah was demonstrating with her traditional approach. The Navy SEAL team's systematic methodology was producing acceptable results, but not matching the remarkable accuracy achieved through fundamental fieldcraft and environmental reading skills. Sarah's final shot at 3,800 meters would determine the competition outcome and validate or challenge prevailing wisdom about precision shooting methodology. Wind conditions had continued to evolve throughout the afternoon, requiring fresh calculations based on updated environmental observations. Her approach remained consistent with techniques developed over decades of hunting experience and careful study of ballistic principles. The third shot felt perfect from the moment Sarah pressed the trigger. Every element of her shooting process came together with precision that represented the culmination of a lifetime's dedication to marksmanship fundamentals. The rifle recoiled naturally against her shoulder, the sight picture remained undisturbed through the entire shot sequence, and her environmental reading had been applied with confidence based on proven techniques. The bullet's flight at 3,800 meters seemed to last forever as Sarah maintained position behind her scope, waiting for the target indication that would appear in slightly over 4 seconds. When the marker finally showed, the result confirmed what had seemed impossible when the competition began. Center ring. 3 perfect shots at 3,800 meters, completing a performance that achieved perfection at every distance throughout the competition. Sarah Mitchell, the wildlife photographer from Montana, had defeated the best military snipers in the world using a wooden-stocked hunting rifle and techniques passed down from her grandfather. The silence that followed her final shot was broken by Morrison approaching her position with genuine respect and curiosity. "Ma'am, that was the most remarkable shooting I've ever witnessed," he said, offering his hand in congratulation. "I'd be honored to learn from your environmental reading techniques." Competition officials confirmed what the target markers had already indicated. Sarah had achieved the first perfect score in the event's history, hitting center ring on every shot from 800 meters through 3,800 meters. Her victory margin was decisive, with no other competitor achieving consistent accuracy at the extreme distances where her performance had been flawless. The awards ceremony that evening drew military personnel, competitive shooters, and media representatives who had come to witness what many expected would be a demonstration of technological superiority in precision marksmanship. Instead, they had observed a validation of fundamental skills and traditional techniques that predated modern technological approaches by generations. Sarah's acceptance speech was brief and humble, focusing on her grandfather's teaching and the importance of understanding fundamental principles rather than relying solely on technological solutions. She emphasized that her victory represented not the superiority of one approach over another, but rather the enduring value of patient observation, careful practice, and respect for the discipline of marksmanship. The $50,000 prize money would help with her wildlife photography business, but the true significance of her achievement extended far beyond personal benefit. Military training programs would examine her techniques, competitive shooters would study her environmental reading methods, and equipment manufacturers would reconsider the balance between technological complexity and fundamental effectiveness. Her grandfather's rifle, the wooden-stocked hunting rifle that had been dismissed by many as inadequate for serious competition, had proven capable of accuracy that exceeded the most sophisticated modern systems when guided by skilled hands and informed understanding. The victory validated his belief that precision came from the shooter's knowledge and ability rather than from technological advantages. As Sarah packed her equipment for the journey home to Montana, she reflected on the day's events and their broader implications. The competition had proven that fundamental marksmanship skills, properly developed and consistently applied, remained relevant in an age of increasing technological sophistication. Her grandfather's legacy lived on not just in the rifle he had crafted, but in the knowledge and techniques he had passed down through patient teaching and careful example. The story of Sarah Mitchell's victory would spread throughout the military and competitive shooting communities, inspiring renewed interest in traditional marksmanship fundamentals while proving that the marriage of technology and fundamental skill could produce extraordinary results. Her achievement stood as testimony to the enduring value of patient observation, careful practice, and the wisdom that comes from understanding rather than simply applying advanced technology. The shot heard around the world had been fired not by the most advanced equipment or sophisticated technology, but by a woman who understood that true precision comes from the shooter's knowledge, skill, and respect for the eternal principles that govern the flight of every bullet across every distance.